You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, Nigel here. I couldn't help noticing that you're still awake. Now, I'm an owl. I'm supposed to be up at night, but you need your sleep. So if it's your allergy symptoms that are keeping you up, here's a word to the wise. Try Xyzal. You see, Xyzal works fast to relieve sneezing, runny nose, itchy watery eyes, and itchy nose and throat. And it keeps going strong for 24 hours, so you can get your sleep and wake up refreshed and ready for a productive day ahead. Be wise, all. Take Xyzal at night. Use as directed. Starts working in 45 minutes.
It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask kindergarten teacher Miss Gibson.
Give me just one Clorox wipe and I'm ready for glitter glue, exploded lunchbox yogurt, peanut butter handprints, runny noses, picking noses, rubbing noses.
Touching noses.
Thank you, Edward. Ooh, nap mats and lockers and tissue boxes. And
Clorox
scissors.
disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe. Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 234, After the Battle of Britain Part 2, Big Wings, Big Egos. This week, a big thank you goes out to Sam and Bob for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast's episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. By the end of September, the greatest danger of an invasion appeared to be over. Anyone in Britain knew that the daylight raids that had been a fixture of life in southeast England were no longer happening. And while the nighttime bombing continued, there were already triumphant stories of victory in the newspapers. Among British leaders, they had better intelligence than what was available to the press, and from that perspective, it was even more apparent that the German invasion preparations that had been underway for the last several months were seemingly being undone. Barges and ships were dispersing, ground forces were being repositioned, decrypted messages showed orders for movements of troops for other duties. All of these were hallmarks that the invasion was cancelled, or at the very least postponed, until maybe the spring of 1941. The focus of Luftwaffe operations would be on night bombing for the following months, and that meant a reprieve for the pilots and ground crew of Fighter Command, which had bore the brunt of the fighting since August. Even though Fighter Command had accomplished its goal of surviving the Luftwaffe onslaught, there were disagreements within the leadership about why that success had been achieved and how it might have been achieved easier. Starting in roughly mid-August, there was a major disagreement between Park, the leader of 11 Group, and Leigh-Mallory, the head of 12 Group, about the best way to meet German raids and the best way to defeat them. That disagreement would spiral out into infighting that would last until Leigh-Mallory would replace Park as the head of 11 Group in December 1940. And not to spoil this episode too much, but if you happen to be a big Leigh-Mallory supporter, you might just want to stop listening now. The debates between Leigh-Mallory, Park, and the head of Fighter Command, Dowding, were at least outwardly rooted in disagreements about the effectiveness of how British fighter squadrons should be organized. This required some kind of evaluation of how the current structure was performing, and then comparisons to a different system. Trying to do these comparisons during the height of a major air campaign ran into a few major issues that are worth reviewing before we dive into how the debates occurred and their outcomes. The first issue was that the Germans were changing their tactics all the time. Maybe not in major ways, but in small ways. The structure of German raids and their behavior of their fighter escorts were changing, even if sometimes those changes were as small as the high escort moving 5,000 feet higher, or more fighters being dedicated to close support. These constant small changes meant that the British had to constantly slightly change their own methods in response. The bigger issue, though, and one this podcast has discussed constantly over the last month or month and a half, although mostly from the German perspective, was the issue of understanding the outcome of any given aerial engagement. The Luftwaffe pilots were not the only ones that were overcounting their victories against the enemy, and within Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons, there was just as much double, triple, or even higher multiples being counted every time a German plane was shot down. This was a critical factor in the debates between Park and Leigh-Mallory, because at the core of Leigh-Mallory's idea was that a larger number of fighters should be attacking the bombing raids all at one time, all together. But the more aircraft that were involved, the greater the chance that the enemy losses that were reported would be greatly exaggerated. As was seen in some of the major raids on London in mid-September that we covered a few episodes ago, the chaos just got out of control when 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squadrons of British fighters all dove in on the German aircraft simultaneously. There was simply way too much happening for pilots to keep track of, and this resulted in damaged aircraft being attacked multiple times and claimed multiple times. This caused issues with how various tactics could be evaluated. Or to quote Niall Mackay and Christopher Price from Safety in Numbers, Ideas of Concentration in Royal Aircraft Fighter Defense from Lancaster to the Battle of Britain, quote, "The issue of force concentration in the Battle of Britain provides a case study in the problems of translating military theory into battlefield practice. The aim of models, theory, and principles is to approach underlying truth through clarity of thought. When, through either misuse or diffusion, this clarity is lost, they risk rather obscuring the truth." End quote. Basically, if the decisions and conversations were being had with incorrect information, it was very possible that the incorrect decisions would be made. Air Vice-Marshal Park, head of 11 Group, with the full support of Air Chief Dowding, had a very specific idea of the best way to meet the German raids that were occurring during the Battle of Britain, particularly in the beginning, when the Germans were generally launching many smaller raids throughout the day. The basic idea is that every raid should be met by something, whether that was one squadron or multiple squadrons. Each one should be defended against, and they should be hit as early and as often as possible. This was a challenge in some cases due to how close the targets were to the coast, because this meant that the RAF squadrons did not have any time to concentrate or wait for anybody else. They simply had to dive into the fight as soon as possible, otherwise they would miss their opportunity. This strategy brought with it some major downsides, the most important of which is that it meant that the RAF fighters would always be at a numerical disadvantage. They would always be facing a greater number of German fighters and bombers, and they would just have to deal with that problem. This did not always mean that they were wiped from the sky. Aerial combat during the Second World War really didn't work like that, but it did mean that in some cases they were unable to get to the bombers or were unable to damage many enemy aircraft. Another issue with this strategy is that it went against the general military guidance of concentration, and instead of truly stopping one German bombing raid out of several, 11 Group was spreading out its strength and merely annoying many of the raids. There were benefits to this strategy, though, and it was these benefits that Park and Dowding would emphasize when supporting their ideas and decisions. The most important benefit is that it provided maximum disruption on as many raids as possible, with the hope that even minimal fighter defenses resulted in more bombs falling off target. The goal was to allow no raids to drop their bombs without being harassed in some way by British fighters, and they did largely achieve this goal, with a few exceptions where mistakes were made in intercept positioning, which were mistakes not related to the strategy that they were pursuing. 11 Group's tactics also made it very difficult for the Germans to really understand the strength of RAF Fighter Command, because they were constantly only seeing tiny portions of it committed against a raid at any given time. This would play into the continued German underestimation of Fighter Command strength, with those evaluations made even more challenging due to how the RAF was moving around squadrons throughout the battle. The topic of moving squadrons around ties into another area of disagreement between 11 Group and 12 Group. Core to Dowding's beliefs on how to fight the Battle of Britain was the idea that 11 Group should always be kept as strong as possible through the rotation of squadrons in and out of 11 Group as they were worn down and needed to be replaced. This served two major purposes. It would give Park and 11 Group the greatest strength with which to defend the pivotal areas of southeast England, while also obscuring from the Germans the true state of Fighter Command. Or to quote from a meeting at Fighter Command headquarters on September 7th, quote, "The Commander-in-Chief, Dowding, stressed the fact that it was absolutely essential that the enemy should not become aware that he had materially damaged us. It was imperative that an undiminished front exist in the southeast, because the enemy was undoubtedly feeling the strain very much at the same time, and nothing should be afforded them in the nature of encouragement. It was absolutely essential that the enemy should be made to believe that our strength was in no way diminished. Number 11 Group must have the best of everything and go on fighting until, if necessary, everything had been used up." End quote. The exact impact that this had on German understanding of RAF strength is obfuscated by all the mistakes that they were making in estimations of that strength in general, but Dowding did not know that those mistakes were being made at this time. One of the more important impacts that this emphasis on 11 Group had was that it made it very, very crystal clear to everyone which group was the most important, and it was not 12 Group, something that seems to have rankled Leigh-Mallory, who clearly was not pleased with playing second fiddle.
United Healthcare nurse Crystal checked in on a patient.
We do a routine call after surgery, and I could tell in her voice that she was struggling.
Crystal knew she needed help.
And I knew that this is very serious. This is like septic. This is life-threatening.
And she knew just what to do.
And I called the hospital and said, she's coming in, here are her labs.
And got her the help she needed.
I see my role at United Healthcare as a life-saving role.
Hear more stories like Crystal's at uhc.com. Benefits, features, and/or devices vary by plan area. Limitation and exclusions apply.
Leading a business today means constantly adapting. On the Executive Insights podcast, brought to you by AWS, global leaders share how they're making tough calls, testing bold ideas, and putting innovation into practice, generative AI included. If you're looking for real stories behind what's working, this is it. Subscribe to the Executive Insights podcast today, available now on all major podcast platforms.
Beyond some issues with where Fighter Command was placing its emphasis, there were real disagreements between 11 and 12 Group about the best way to defeat the Germans. Leigh-Mallory and one of his squadron leaders, Douglas Bader, firmly believed that Park's strategy of meeting raids with small numbers of fighters was wasteful, both in terms of losses and effort. Instead, they favored the opposite approach, and instead of trying to meet every raid with a small force, they believed that instead fighter squadrons should be concentrated in what they called a big wing of 4 or more squadrons, and then altogether they should descend on German formations. This did have very clear benefits that were impossible to deny, and nobody would deny them. By meeting a raid with a larger number of fighters, it was much more likely that the German fighter escorts would be overwhelmed, which would allow the British fighters the freedom to attack the bombers. This would, theoretically, result in more bombers being shot down, which was the entire goal of Fighter Command, to shoot down as many bombers as possible. It was also hoped that this would result in fewer damaged and destroyed Spitfires and Hurricanes, because they would not be entering into combat at a disadvantage. But there were issues, which Leigh-Mallory would of course downplay and Park would of course emphasize. The biggest issue was that assembling squadrons into one formation took time. It was a simple math problem around how many aircraft could take off from one airfield at one time, or from multiple airfields and then meet up in the air. The first planes off the ground would have to loiter until everyone else was in the air, and only then could they fly off to their targets. This resulted in a slower response to any notice of a German raid, which 12 Group was not as much concerned about, because they were further away from the German action. But Park felt that his squadrons simply could never waste time waiting in the air. The greater time required to gather up also would reduce the number of sorties that a given squadron could do in a single day. In some cases, 11 Group squadrons were doing 4 sorties in a day, 4 times up in the air on patrol. And it simply was not possible if they spent any extra time in the air waiting for others. But in many ways, 12 Group also was not working under these same issues, because their position further from some of the German raids meant that they were not launching as many sorties as often anyway, because it took them longer to get to and from the fighting. I'm emphasizing the differences here because in retrospect, one of the most interesting aspects of the big wing debate was the fact that if you take the personalities and the politics out of the equation, you're left with the simple fact that 2 different commanders were working under 2 very different sets of constraints. 12 Group did not have to worry about its airfields being bombed, or the challenges involved in meeting another raid immediately after they met one that just attacked, because they had distance, they had space. 11 Group had none of that freedom. If you want to give Leigh-Mallory the benefit of the doubt, and you want to be as favorable as possible to his viewpoint, you are still left with the fact that he clearly either dismissed or did not grasp the challenges faced by 11 Group. It is at the very least a clear case of a military officer that had ideas about how to do something and when somebody else acted differently, immediately made the assumption that they were doing things wrong, without any consideration for what might be forcing them into those decisions. I'm not convinced that Leigh-Mallory's attack on Park was rooted in such a simple mistake, though, which comes back to the personalities and politics. While the disagreements between Park and Leigh-Mallory would simmer for most of August and throughout early September, they would really only come to a head, oddly enough, after the threat of the German invasion had passed. It turns out when you're faced with German air raids every single day, there's only so much bandwidth for sort of squabbling among commanders. The cause for the disagreements boiling over was a report that was published by Leigh-Mallory in the wake of the major German bombing raids over London during the second week of September. These were covered a few episodes ago, but they were the raids that were met by absolute swarms of British fighters from both 11 and 12 Group. The general structure of the British response was that 11 Group met them with 2, sometimes 3 squadrons as the German bombers approached London, and then 12 Group would arrive with a big wing of at least 5 squadrons once they were over London. To summarize Leigh-Mallory's conclusions in his report, basically the big wing from 12 Group had won a great victory over London due to its arrival in great number. This report then made it around important circles in London, which would shape the thoughts and debate over the following months. There were problems with the report, though, the most important being the greatly inflated numbers that it presented due to the challenges of estimating the victories in the air when so many fighters were involved. Leigh-Mallory presented the numbers reported from his pilots without the caveats and context that they probably needed, and Park took great offense to this. The squadrons of 11 Group had been fighting for their lives for months. They had launched far more fighters at the German raids over London, and yet 12 Group was somehow claiming that they had some kind of prime role in the victory, and with inflated numbers that were clearly wrong. Dowding, while he had supported Park's tactics, would also at least move in support of the big wing idea in late September and early October, if only due to the political pressure being placed on Fighter Command due to the support for Leigh-Mallory that had been generated by the report and by Leigh-Mallory's relationships with important people in London. Park would answer with a report that it was simply impossible for 11 Group to follow the processes of 12 Group if the goal was to engage German bombers before they reached their targets, and it had been even more impossible over the months of fighting because it was essential that they be met before they dropped bombs on 11 Group airfields. In this report, he included track charts which made it clear that if he waited for larger formations to intercept the German bombers, they would have made it to the airfields. They would have been dropping bombs on their facilities before they were even engaged. He also made it clear that one of the problems that 11 Group faced, that 12 Group did not, was the many patrols that were being asked of his fighters, with patrols being in the air constantly to meet German raids, instead of just waiting prepped on the ground, waiting for the call to come in. Park would also try and get his views read at the Air Ministry, with another report that outlined what he had been trying to do and why. The disagreements between the group leaders would culminate in a meeting on October 17, 1940. The meeting was essentially an attack on Park, his leadership, and his decision-making. Both Leigh-Mallory and his squadron leader, Bader, would be present, and the minutes of the meeting made it clear that Park was simply on the defensive the entire time, constantly having to justify what he had done. Dowding seemed to have not come to the defense of Park in the way that might have been expected, given his previous support of Park's operations. It is worth noting that Bader was the only pilot or squadron leader present at the meeting, and no first-hand testimony from any 11 Group pilot was sought on this matter. This was important because, as would become clear in the weeks that followed, one of the important parts of Leigh-Mallory's and Bader's argument was that they claimed that 11 Group morale was sapped by Park constantly sending his pilots into battle outnumbered. While the number issue can be seen mentioned in many 11 Group accounts, there's little indication that morale was a problem within 11 Group. In fact, Park's accounts had very many things to say about the morale of 12 Group squadrons that were transferred to him throughout the battle, with concerns that they had been told that it was only safe to engage the enemy when in large formations, which was not always possible, and that made them timid in some situations. While the meetings on October 17th were important, Park would not be removed from command immediately. It was clear, though, by the end of October that he was on his way out. 12 Group headquarters became a popular place to visit by members of the War Cabinet, who were filled with the ideas of Bader and Leigh-Mallory and their big wings and the amazing things that they could do. Park, for his part, would begin big wing operations during the second half of October, but the results for 11 Group would be disappointing, with it being put into action 10 times with only recording a single downed enemy. This would be outlined in a report by Park to Dowding in early November, which was circulated like the previous reports, but it didn't make any difference. The criticism of Park and the attacks on his leadership would also trickle up to Dowding as well, with Dowding being removed from command of Fighter Command on November 25th, although his failure to react to the German night bomber raids with night fighters was a major part of his removal as well. His final message would go out to all operational squadrons of Fighter Command, and it would read, quote, "My dear fighter boys, in sending you this, my last message, I wish I could say all that is in my heart. I cannot hope to surpass the simple eloquence of the Prime Minister's words. Never before has so much been owed by so many to so few. The debt remains and will increase. In saying goodbye to you, I want you to know how continually you have been in my thoughts, and that through our direct communication may be severed, I may yet be able to help you in our gallant fight. Goodbye to you, and God bless you all." End quote. Dowding would represent British interests in America for a while before retiring in 1942, being elevated to a barony in 1943, and choosing the title of the Lord Dowding of Bentley Priory, with Bentley Priory being the location of the headquarters of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. Churchill would write years later, quote, "The foresight of Air Marshal Dowding in his direction of Fighter Command deserves high praise, and even more remarkable had been the restraint and the exact measurement of formidable stresses which had reserved a fighter force in the north through all these long weeks of mortal conflict in the south. We must regard the generalship here shown as an example of genius in the art of war." End quote. Park would hold on a little while longer after Dowding was removed, being made a member of the Order of the Bath in early December before being replaced by Leigh-Mallory on December 18th. Park would be moved to training command before taking a posting in Egypt and then Malta. This means that this will not be the last time that Park features on the podcast. He will appear again, and he will play a major role in defending against another major Luftwaffe offensive, this time in the skies over Malta in 1942. It's interesting to look back on the disagreements between Leigh-Mallory and Bader and Park and Dowding and others within the upper reaches of RAF Fighter Command, because it's clear to us now that they were arguing in the afterglow of their greatest victory. The Royal Air Force would go on to play a crucial role in the British war effort for the rest of the war, roughly 4.5 years of warfare after Battle of Britain Day. But never again would it be the focus of the entire war like it was between June and September 1940. The Luftwaffe had one singular goal throughout the summer months of 1940, destroy RAF Fighter Command, and Fighter Command had one single goal, survive. And they'd survived. The list of reasons that they survived is long and broad, with so many decisions, actions, and people taking part not just in 1940, but for years before the war even started. But two of the people that had been critical to those preparations, who had made so many of those decisions, who had taken many of those actions at some point, in some of the most stressful moments imaginable, were Hugh Dowding and Keith Park. They had commanded the two most important positions in the entire Royal Air Force, some might say the entire British war effort, during the summer of 1940. Dowding commanded Fighter Command and had been the person most responsible for the preparations and organizations that had been done before the war. He had supported the creation of the chain home radar stations, had taken steps to make sure that radar information got to squadrons fast enough for them to react, supported the projects that had put Hurricanes and Spitfires in the air, and organized Fighter Command in a way that allowed it to meet its greatest challenge. Park had commanded 11 Group, which encompassed the area that was guaranteed to be the most crucial of the entire campaign. The Luftwaffe had done its best to destroy his entire command, and yet it had survived, with Park making the correct and sometimes the only decisions at crucial moments that allowed the best possible response to German actions, even if the best possible response still meant far from optimal. Even though the few would become the famous heroes of the Battle of Britain, the pilots always get the most glory. The Battle of Britain was won by thousands of people all over Britain, and two of those men were Hugh Dowding and Keith Park. And in the aftermath of that great victory, when they had saved Britain from a German invasion, they were cast aside. Those who replaced them had their reasons for wanting them gone. I think they were rubbish, but obviously somebody thought they had merit. And, as fate would have it, they were replaced at the moment where the arguments and disagreements that their dismissal was built around no longer mattered. By the end of November, Luftwaffe fighter and bomber forces would never again truly threaten in daylight raids over Britain. That was in the past. Instead, there was a new threat, a threat that required completely different technology, completely different tactics, completely different ideas to defeat. Because it was time for the night after night after night of bombing raids that would come to be known as the Blitz.